When I got the call that my grandmother was in the hospital and didn't have much time left, my heart sank. She was the one person in my family who had always been there for me, the one who understood me when no one else did. I immediately told my parents I needed to see her, but they shut me down. "It's not the right time," my mom said, her voice cold. "You have work, and it's too far to travel right now." My dad nodded in agreement, adding, "She wouldn't even recognize you in her condition. It's better to remember her as she was." Their words felt like a slap. How could they stop me from saying goodbye to the woman who raised me when my parents were too busy with their own lives? I tried to reason with them, begging and pleading, but they wouldn't budge. Every time I brought it up, they changed the subject or made me feel guilty for even asking. "You're being selfish," my mom said once. "Think about how hard this is for us." I couldn't understand why they were so against me going. It wasn't like I was asking them to come with me. I was an adult, capable of making my own decisions, but they acted like I was still a child who needed their permission. The more they refused, the more suspicious I became. There had to be a reason they didn't want me to see her, but I couldn't figure out what it was. One night, I overheard my parents arguing in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but I caught snippets of the conversation. "She can't find out," my dad said. "If she goes there, it'll all come out." My mom replied, "We've kept it hidden this long. She doesn't need to know." My heart raced. What were they hiding? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I booked a flight without telling them, packed a bag, and left a note saying I'd be back in a few days. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I needed to see my grandmother. When I arrived at the hospital, I was shocked by how frail she looked. Tubes and machines surrounded her, and her breathing was shallow. But when she saw me, her eyes lit up. "You came," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with love. I held her hand, tears streaming down my face. "Of course I came," I said. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." She smiled faintly and then said something that shattered me. "I'm so sorry, my dear. I never wanted you to find out this way." I frowned, confused. "Find out what?" She took a deep breath and began to tell me the truth. My grandmother explained that my parents had been keeping a secret from me for years. When I was a child, my parents had gone through a rough patch financially. Desperate for money, they had taken out a loan using my grandmother's house as collateral, but they never paid it back. The bank had threatened to take the house, and my grandmother had been forced to sell it to cover their debt. She had lost her home because of their selfishness, and they had never told me. "I didn't want you to think badly of them," she said, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't let you go on believing they were perfect." I was stunned. All these years, my parents had been lying to me, and my grandmother had carried the burden of their mistakes. As I sat there trying to process everything, my phone buzzed. It was my mom. "Where are you?" she demanded. "We saw your note. You can't just run off like this." I took a deep breath and said, "I'm with Grandma." She told me everything. There was a long silence on the other end. Then my mom said, "It's not what you think. We were going to tell you eventually." I laughed bitterly. "When? After she was gone? After you'd convinced me not to come?" My dad's voice cut in, angry and defensive. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. We did what we had to do." I shook my head, even though they couldn't see me. "No, you did what was easiest for you, and you let Grandma pay the price." I stayed by my grandmother's side until she passed away peacefully that night. Her last words to me were, "Don't let their mistakes define you. Live your life with kindness, but don't let anyone take advantage of you." I promised her I would. When I returned home, my parents tried to act like nothing had happened, but I couldn't look at them the same way. I moved out shortly after and cut off contact with them. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do. My grandmother's words stayed with me, guiding me as I built a life of my own. She had given me the strength to walk away from the lies and start fresh, and for that I would always be grateful. Just when I thought I had put the past behind me, something happened that turned everything upside down again. It started with a phone call from my uncle. His voice was tense, and I could tell something was wrong. "You need to come over," he said. "There's something you need to see." I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my keys and drove to his house. When I arrived, my uncle handed me an old dusty box. "Your grandmother left this for you," he said. "She told me to give it to you when the time was right." I opened the box carefully, my hands trembling. Inside were stacks of letters, photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. The letters were addressed to me, written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. The photographs were of her and me, pictures I had never seen before, from when I was a child. But it was the journal that caught my attention. It was filled with entries dating back years, detailing her thoughts, her struggles, and her regrets. As I flipped through the pages, one entry stood out. It was dated just a few months before she passed away. In it, she wrote about a secret she had been keeping, a secret she had planned to tell me but never got the chance. My heart raced as I read her words. She revealed that my parents weren't the only ones who had made mistakes. She had made one too, and it was something that could change everything I thought I knew about my family. According to the journal, my grandmother had discovered something about my father years ago, something so shocking that she had kept it hidden to protect the family. She wrote that my father wasn't her biological son. He had been adopted as a baby, and she had never told him the truth. She had always planned to reveal it, but as the years went by, the secret became harder to share. She feared it would destroy him, and by extension, our family. But now, with her gone, she wanted me to know the truth. I sat there, stunned. My mind raced as I tried to process what I had just read. My father, adopted. It explained so much. The tension between him and my grandmother, the way he always seemed to resent her, even the way my parents had treated me. But it also raised so many questions. Who were his real parents? Why had my grandmother kept this a secret for so long? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information? My uncle watched me carefully as I closed the journal. "I didn't know about this," he said quietly, "but I think she wanted you to decide what to do with it." I nodded, feeling the weight of her trust. This wasn't just a secret, it was a responsibility. I had to decide whether to tell my father or keep it buried, just as she had. For days, I agonized over the decision. Part of me wanted to confront my parents, to throw the truth in their faces and watch them squirm. But another part of me remembered my grandmother's words about kindness and the importance of family. I didn't want to hurt my father, but I also didn't want to live with the guilt of keeping such a huge secret. In the end, I decided to talk to my uncle again. He had always been the voice of reason in our family, and I needed his advice. We met at the same cafe where I had confronted my parents months earlier. I told him everything, about the journal, the adoption, and my grandmother's regrets. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This is a heavy burden," he said, "but I think your grandmother trusted you to handle it the right way." I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "But what's the right way?" I asked. He smiled gently. "The right way is the way that brings you peace." His words stayed with me as I left the cafe. I still didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep this secret forever. Whether I told my father or not, I had to find a way to move forward. My grandmother had given me the truth, but it was up to me to decide what to do with it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The decision to tell my father about the adoption wasn't an easy one. I spent weeks wrestling with the idea, going back and forth between wanting to reveal the truth and fearing the fallout. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep it hidden forever. My grandmother had entrusted me with this secret, and I owed it to her, and to myself, to handle it with honesty and care. I called my parents and asked if we could meet. My mom sounded surprised but agreed, and we set a date for the following weekend. When the day came, I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I brought the journal with me, along with the letters and photographs my grandmother had left. I didn't know how my father would react, but I was prepared for anything. We met at their house, the same place where I had grown up. It felt strange walking through the door after so many months of distance. My mom greeted me with a hesitant smile, and my father nodded curtly from his chair in the living room. The tension in the air was palpable. I took a deep breath and sat down across from them. "I need to talk to you about something important," I began, my voice steady despite the nerves. My parents exchanged a glance but didn't say anything. I opened the box and pulled out the journal, placing it on the table between us. "Grandma left this for me. It's her journal, and there's something in it that you need to know." My father's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone guarded. I took another deep breath and flipped to the entry about the adoption. "Dad," I said, looking him straight in the eye, "Grandma wrote that you were adopted. She never told you, and she regretted keeping it a secret for so long." For a moment there was complete silence. My father stared at the journal, his face unreadable. My mom looked shocked, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" she whispered. "That can't be true." I nodded, my heart pounding. "It's all in here," I said, pushing the journal toward them. "She wanted you to know, but she didn't know how to tell you." My father picked up the journal and began to read, his hands trembling slightly. As he read, his expression shifted from disbelief to anger to something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe, or regret. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't she tell me?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I could do was repeat what my grandmother had written, that she had wanted to protect him, to protect all of us. My mom reached out and took his hand, her own eyes filled with tears. "I am so sorry," she said softly. "I had no idea." The rest of the conversation was a blur. My father asked questions, and I answered as best as I could. But there were some things even I didn't know. Who were his biological parents? Why had he been given up for adoption? Those were questions my grandmother had never answered, and now we might never know. But despite the pain and confusion, there was also a sense of relief. The truth was out, and for the first time in a long time, there were no more secrets between us. As I left their house that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was sad for my father, for the life he could have had if he had known the truth sooner. But I was also proud of myself for having the courage to tell him. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. And as I drove home, I thought about my grandmother and the legacy she had left behind. She had taught me the importance of honesty, even when it was hard, and I knew she would be proud of me too. The days that followed were difficult. My father struggled to come to terms with the truth, and there were moments of anger and resentment. But there were also moments of connection, of understanding. We started to talk more, to share our feelings in a way we never had before. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally on the path to healing. The revelation about my father's adoption opened a floodgate of questions that none of us had answers to. Who were his biological parents? Why had they given him up? And why had my grandmother kept this secret for so long? The more we thought about it, the more we realized that we needed to find the truth, not just for my father's sake, but for all of us. My father was hesitant at first. "What's the point?" he asked one evening when I brought up the idea of searching for his biological family. "It's been over 60 years. They're probably gone by now." But I could see the curiosity in his eyes, the longing to know where he came from. "Don't you want to know?" I asked gently. He sighed and nodded. "I do, but I'm scared of what we might find." I understood his fear. The truth could be painful, but it could also be healing. With my father's reluctant blessing, I began the search. I started by reaching out to my uncle, hoping he might know something, but he was just as in the dark as we were. Your grandmother never talked about it, he said. She took that secret to her grave. Next, I turned to the internet. I signed up for a DNA testing service and convinced my father to do the same. It felt like a long shot, but it was the best place to start. While we waited for the results, I dug through old family records, looking for any clues that might lead us to the truth. I found a few documents, my grandmother's marriage certificate, my father's birth certificate, but nothing that pointed to his biological parents. The DNA results came back a few weeks later, and they were both exciting and overwhelming. My father had several distant relatives listed, but none of them were close enough to give us a clear picture of his origins. I reached out to a few of them, explaining our situation and asking if they knew anything about my father's adoption. Most of them were sympathetic, but couldn't help. One woman, however, responded with a surprising piece of information. I think I might know something, she wrote in her email. My great-aunt used to talk about a baby boy who was adopted in the 1950s. She said it was a big scandal at the time, but she never gave any details. I'll ask around and see if I can find out more. Her email gave us hope, but it also made us nervous. What kind of scandal could have led to my father's adoption? Was it something we even wanted to know? My father was torn. Part of him wanted to keep digging, but another part wanted to let it go. Maybe some secrets are better left buried, he said one night, but I could tell he was just as curious as I was. A few days later, the woman emailed again. This time she had a name, Margaret. My great-aunt said the baby's mother was named Margaret, she wrote. She was young and unmarried, and her family sent her away to have the baby in secret. After the adoption, she never talked about it again. The name Margaret didn't mean anything to us, but it was a starting point. I began searching for records of women named Margaret who had lived in the area around the time of my father's birth. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but I was determined. After weeks of searching, I finally found something. A birth record for a baby boy born to a woman named Margaret in 1952. The date matched my father's birth year, and the location was close to where my grandmother had lived. I showed the record to my father, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Do you think this could be her? He asked. I nodded. It's possible, but we'll need to do more digging to be sure. The search was far from over, but we were closer than we had ever been. For the first time in his life, my father had a name, a face, and a story to connect to his past. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as we continued to search, I realized that this wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about giving my father the closure he had always deserved. The discovery of Margaret's name gave us a renewed sense of purpose, but it also brought a wave of emotions. My father was hesitant to take the next step, reaching out to her, if she was still alive. What if she doesn't want to see me? He asked one evening, his voice tinged with vulnerability. What if I'm just a painful reminder of her past? I understood his fear, but I also knew that we couldn't stop now. We had come too far to turn back. With my father's permission, I hired a private investigator to help us track down Margaret. It felt like a long shot, but we had to try. The investigator was thorough, combing through old records, tracking down leads, and even reaching out to people who might have known Margaret. Weeks turned into months, and just when we were starting to lose hope, we got a call. I think I've found her, the investigator said. Margaret is living in a small town about 3 hours from here. She's in her late 80s, but she's still sharp. I've spoken to her, and she's willing to meet. My heart raced as I relayed the news to my father. He was silent for a long time, processing what this meant. Finally, he nodded. Let's do it, he said. I need to know. The day of the meeting was filled with tension. My father was quiet on the drive, lost in thought. I could only imagine what was going through his mind. Decades of questions, doubts, and emotions all coming to a head. When we arrived at Margaret's house, a small, cozy home with a garden out front, my father hesitated. What if she regrets it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I squeezed his hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Margaret greeted us at the door, She was frail but had a warm smile and kind eyes. When she saw my father, her eyes filled with tears. "You look just like him," she said softly. My father frowned. "Like who?" he asked. Margaret gestured for us to come inside, and we sat down in her living room. She took a deep breath and began to tell her story. Margaret had been just 18 when she became pregnant. Her family was strict and deeply religious, and they had sent her away to have the baby in secret. She had wanted to keep him, but her family had insisted on the adoption. "I never stopped thinking about you," she said, looking at my father. "But I was young and scared, and I didn't have a choice." As she spoke, my father listened intently, his expression a mix of sadness and relief. When she finished, he reached out and took her hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I've spent my whole life wondering where I came from. Now I know." The meeting was emotional, but it was also healing. Margaret shared stories about her life, and my father told her about his. They laughed, they cried, and for the first time my father felt a connection to his past. It wasn't perfect. There were still unanswered questions, and the pain of the past couldn't be erased. But it was a start. On the drive home, my father was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. He seemed at peace, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I couldn't have done this without you." I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "You deserve to know the truth," I said. "And now you do." In the months that followed, my father stayed in touch with Margaret. They didn't have a traditional mother-son relationship, it was too late for that, but they found a way to connect. My father also began to open up more, sharing his feelings and memories in a way he never had before. It was as if the truth had set him free, allowing him to finally be himself. As for me, I felt a deep sense of closure. I had honored my grandmother's wishes by revealing the truth, and I had helped my father find the answers he had always needed. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I doubted whether we were doing the right thing, but in the end, it was worth it. My relationship with my parents is still complicated, but it's better than it was. We've started to rebuild slowly and carefully, with honesty and respect. And while the past will always be a part of us, it no longer defines us. We've learned to move forward, to focus on the present and the future. My grandmother's legacy lives on in the lessons she taught me, about kindness, honesty, and the importance of family. She may be gone, but her love and wisdom continue to guide me. And as I look back on everything we've been through, I realize that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. We found the truth, and in doing so, we found ourselves. And for that, I will always be grateful.